Okay, this is a patch 25.22 patch notes. Here we got nerfs to Akshan, LeBlanc, Talon, Phase Rush, and Biscuit Delivery. Why is this? Oh, it's formatted differently this time. They put Phase Rush and Biscuit, their system changes aren't in a separate category. They've lumped all the nerfs together and then all the buffs, including system buffs, together. They're adjusting Skarner, Volley Bear, and then they're buffing Aurelion Soul, Blitzcrank, Yone, Cashback, Guardian, Hail of Blades, Bloodline, Movement Speed Shard, Nimbus Cloak, Tenacity Shard, and Triple Tonic. So a lot of rune changes this patch. Not a lot of champion changes. What do we got? 8 champion changes here. Probably relatively minor. Some of these, like, unless it's a crazy change, I would assume that some of these changes are going to be relatively minor as well on some of these champions. You know, keep in mind as we're getting towards the end of the season that there is no longer a preseason. So, you know, honestly, with Worlds out of the way, things will probably slow down quite a bit while they figure out and work on what's going to happen at the start of next season. And they probably don't want to be that disruptive on the end of the ranked season. You know, and the game is fairly balanced. So I just don't think they're going to do a lot for the next month or two until, you know, mid-January or beginning of January when the next season starts. But keep that in mind. And we'll get into the notes here. So, okay, we've got Akshan base health 630 down to 610. And then his Q is going from an 8-second cooldown to 5-second cooldown to 9 seconds to 5 seconds. So that's, I mean, obviously just all around a nerf. I guess I'm kind of wondering why they felt like Akshan. I feel like I remember vaguely an Akshan buff, but maybe I'm just forgetting. I don't remember. So it feels like another one of these changes where they buffed the champion and then reverted it a little bit, or unless I'm just completely delusional and I forgot that they hadn't changed him. But yeah, I mean, it's losing 20 base health is no joke, especially on a champion like Akshan that scales really terribly but is really potent in lane and in the early game. Losing 20 flat health like that kind of sucks, to be honest, for his ability to recklessly take fights in the early game and laning phase and stuff like that. And then, you know, 8 seconds to 5 seconds, 9 seconds to 5 seconds, that doesn't really make much of a difference. I don't think that's a big deal. You know, especially if you're not getting multiple Qs off or something like that, you're just waiting for this to be up before you're going for something anyway. So I don't really think that does almost anything. Aurelion Soul movement speed 335 to 340. Yeah, Aurelion Soul definitely seems to be a champion I haven't seen in a while, so this seems fine. A little bit of movement speed, burst damage 55 to 95 to 60 to 100, so 5 flat damage on his Q, and then the AP ratio is staying the same at 30%, so a very minor change, although 5 movement speed in the past has shown that it can be mean a decent amount for certain champions, especially a champion like Aurelion Soul, who obviously relies on his movement speed in order to deal damage properly and stuff like that. Okay, Blitzcrank. He's been underperforming, so we want to add some more pep to his step. Cooldown 9 to 5 seconds is on his E to 7 to 5 seconds. So he's getting 2 seconds off of his E early. You max Q, so you're going to actually benefit from that quite a decent amount. And obviously, levels are kind of hard to come by on support. I actually think, I was going to say you max W second, but it's actually kind of 50-50. I think people do different things. You get a lot of utility out of getting the E cooldown shorter. And you're not, honestly, Blitzcrank as a champion, obviously, aside from his Q, is pretty useless. So, like, getting access to your E, in my opinion, kind of your second most important. It's like the only thing that you can do in a team fight is Blitzcrank if you miss your hook or your hook's on cooldown. So, getting your E shorter is one of the reasons why, even as powerful as maxing W second is to enable you to get in range of your Q, a lot of people will max E second just because having the lower cooldown on E is so much more impactful, they feel like, than even getting in range of a target with W, or like kind of forcing a W by running at someone. So I definitely think that it's a nice little buff, but obviously, again, not really a major change. LeBlanc health growth is going down by 3 per level from 111 to 108, and armor growth is going down by zero point 0.5 per level from 4.7 to 4.2. Not really a big deal, in my opinion. I mean, I get LeBlanc's doing well, and I don't know, maybe for a squishy champion, taking away some more of their defensive stats could be a bigger deal than I imagine in my head. But to me, it just feels like LeBlanc's health growth and armor growth is not really what's making the difference for the champion or anything like that. I feel like LeBlanc shouldn't be like when LeBlanc goes to burst somebody, or finds the correct play pattern, she's not really taking a whole lot of damage back, especially not enough that, like, you know, 3 HP per level is really going to do a whole lot. So let's say she's level 9 or something like that. You're looking at like 27 less health or something in the, kind of like end of laning phase, like mid game type area. I just don't know that that's going to do a whole lot. I guess you have the armor in conjunction with that, so maybe she take 40 extra damage. I just don't think. Do you ever really see like a lot of situations where a good LeBlanc player jumps in and one shot somebody, but oh dang, they like, in the 1 second they spent jumping into your team, they somehow took 2,000 damage, but you were off by 40 or something, or 30. I don't know about that. So yeah, obviously, I think she's been doing well. And although I haven't seen her a lot personally, but I think I've been seeing that she's been doing well. And like in the win rate and stuff like that. So this seems like a fine, appropriate nerf, and it's not too hard, which I think is okay. Because, I don't know. AD growth. Okay, so we're looking at Skarner. Base AD growth is going from 3 to 4. And then his Q bonus AD ratio is going up by 10% from 80% to 90%. Cooldown, instead of starting on the first cast, starts on the last offensive Q action. So that makes the cooldown longer, because rather than starting, like, let's say when you pick up the rock or something, it starts when you're finished, when you throw the rock. So that's going to make the cooldown longer, because while you're holding the rock and throwing the rock, it's going to be taking down the cooldown before. Now it's not going to do that anymore, but they're compensating by taking the cooldown down from 13 to 7 seconds to 8 to 4, which is very significant. So I don't know how long. I mean, I kind of have in my head how long Skarner players hold their boulder for, or how long they can hold it for. But are they holding it for a full 5 seconds, which is what it would be at rank 1, and then 3 seconds later on? I don't think Skarner is holding his boulder to throw for 5 seconds. So this is actually going to be a shorter cooldown early, maybe about the same cooldown later on. And the bonus AD ratio is going up by 10%. His AD growth is going up by 1 per level. His E added 120% bonus AD ratio just from nothing. That's interesting. And our cast time is going actually up by 1/10 of a second. So that's interesting. Skarner is one of the few champions who's a little weak, but has a deceptively low win rate due to being quite hard to play. Is that true? Is Skarner hard to play? I do not have the impression that Skarner is hard to play, especially not quite hard to play. That's crazy to me. He's a champion who has room for buffs, so we'd like to do that. We're aware of his recent history with pro plays, so we're pairing these buffs with some nerfs that we hope will disproportionately affect low ping pro players. Overall, our goal is a stronger Skarner who can sustain this new level of power for months to come. We're nerfing Impale's cast time to increase his counterplay for skilled opponents. Skarner is meant to occasionally be a juggernaut. We're increasing the viability of AD juggernaut items, specifically Sterix Gauge, by increasing his total base AD and his overall AD scaling. I didn't see that. Well, I guess they mean that through the AD growth, but they didn't buff his base AD, only his AD scaling. But maybe that's what they mean. I wouldn't use the word "and" if you're buffing his total base AD by increasing his overall scaling. But writing's never been Riot's strong suit, to be honest. It's fine. And finally, to make him more approachable, we're removing an. I mean, it's also totally possible, because this happens all the time, that this was a change that they were going to buff his base AD and his AD growth, and then they pulled the change. And the blurb was written before that change got pulled. That's also totally possible. So it gives us a bit of an insight into their thinking, if that's the case, but it may not be. Finally, to make him more approachable, we're removing an awkward optimization around Q's uptime with compensation that should feel similar for most players. Yeah, so they feel like these cooldowns are going to be pretty similar. I think that that's true, especially later on with points into Q. I guess Skarner would max Q first. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but that seems to make sense. So yeah, that's probably right. So this will probably go away. I think you're not going to hold it for 5 seconds, the boulder. So I feel like this will be a little bit of a shorter cooldown early on, but that'll go away pretty quickly. So I think that that's totally fine. Okay, Talon, passive Noxian Diplomacy, damage to monsters 110% to 100%. So they're saying that Talon's running the jungle right now. I think this is another appropriate change. I think that Talon has been pretty good recently, although in probably both mid lane and jungle. But taking this down 10%, I think we saw this with another change. They've started making some of these jungle modification changes much smaller than they had been in the past. So I don't know why, probably because like for me and like for most players, it's just not really intuitive by how much, if you buff this passive, and it's different for each champion's passive, but if you buff Diana passive, or if you buff, I don't know, Pantheon Q damage to modifier to monsters, there's all these different modifiers in the jungle that make things do extra damage. And when you start messing with them, it's really hard to tell on paper. Like I can look at a health decrease or health buff, or an AD increase or an AD buff, or like what they do to some ability or something like that. Like, oh, is the cooldown getting shorter or longer? And I can kind of tell how powerful the effect is going to be roughly from experience. But with jungle passives, it's always so confusing because you don't really know how many seconds it's going to take on or off of clear. Different champions' passive or abilities that they're using to clear just straight up different and have different cooldowns, so they're being used more or less frequently. But when they first started adding these things in and out, they'd add like, well, here's a 250% damage modifier out of nowhere. And I'm glad to see that the last couple of times I've seen these changes, they're, rather than going with these big like 50% at a time changes that either tend to like suddenly propel a champion to be really strong in the jungle out of nowhere, or like completely wipe a champion out of being able to play jungle at all. I think that from what I can tell, as we're learning more about this over the years, going with these lighter, like 10%, maybe 15, 20% changes seems to be a much healthier way to approach changing the modifiers in the jungle, so that you're not instantly propelling a champion into like great success in the jungle or knocking them out of the role completely. Volley Bear, base armor 31 to 35. Base attack damage 60 to 62. Those are some nice buffs. Q, Thundering Smash, minimum movement speed 12 to 28% to 12 to 26%. So that's the same early on, but then down 2% later. The maximum movement speed is 24 to 56% to 24 to 52%. So similar thing there. It's the same, early on with 1 point, but then later on it's twice as slow. Or, well, not twice as slow. It's 4% slower instead of 2% slower, like with the minimum movement speed. So it's double, just like the maximum movement speed is double the minimum movement speed. That's not too bad though. Sky Splitter damage cap against non-champions was 650, which was very high, but now that's going all the way down to 190 and then scales up to 650, but it's got a 70% AP ratio now. For jungle, like, that is really rough, I think, because that's going to greatly reduce the amount of damage because it's just the cap against non-champions. I would think that would reduce the damage that he's doing to his jungle camps quite a bit. Although I guess maybe not if he wasn't hitting the cap anyways. So for example, if he was only doing 190 with 1 point into Yi, then actually it wouldn't matter whether the cap was 190 or 650, because as long as he's not doing over 190, it actually doesn't make a difference. So let's see what they said here. As the dust has settled from Volibear's recent changes, his AD and AP builds are much closer in power, and we believe Jungle Volibear to be appropriately strong. I think that that's right. That said, top lane Volibear is currently quite weak. Yeah, I agree with that. To help him out, we're delivering some changes that are intended to keep Jungle Volley at the same power level, but substantially buff top lane. So basically what they're doing is they're nerfing this, which I think they're hoping to affect jungle because it's only against non-champions. So I don't see how this would... I guess it affects wave clear in top lane, actually. But it looks like what they're trying to do is they're giving a little bit of power in his base armor and his base attack damage, and they're taking just a tad a bit away from his movement speed on his Q later on, and potentially away from his wave clear or jungle clear here with the E. And that's probably targeted as jungle clear, like they said, to compensate for the buffs that they gave to him. Overall, I think a very minor change, but totally fine. Okay, Yone Q base damage 20 to 120 to 25 to 125. So it's just getting 5 flat damage across the board. We buffed Yone last patch, but due to his tendency to build Doran's shield in second wind, he didn't end up as powerful as we would have liked. Since we're happy with the results of reducing his sustain in the last patch, we're re-adding more agency through his ability to hit back at his opposition. I think that's totally fine. Very small change. Okay, let's see what's going on here with all these rune changes, because that's the main gist of the patch, is a lot of rune changes. So biscuit delivery, minimum health regeneration 20 flat to 20 flat, but instead of 2% of your maximum health, you're gaining 1.5% of your maximum health. So that really sucks, because they've been hitting stuff like this. They've been hitting sustain, and now this is even weaker. So that just sucks. I really liked biscuit. It's just gotten worse and worse over time. So that's disappointing to me. Yeah, that's really disappointing. So we'll see about that one. Cashback stonks are low despite the fact that virtually every champion buys items and wants more of them. We're looking to empower this rune to make it a competitive choice in its row. Rebate on legendary item purchase 6% to 8%. That is actually quite substantial, because although people don't go cashback, when you do the math on cashback, it's really not that bad of a rune. And especially if you consider that they're nerfing biscuit, maybe they're going to nerf some other things here. This is 8% back is quite a lot. Now, essentially, cashback replaced futures market in a way, as a way to get kind of extra gold through your runes. But there were some major problems really with the way that these work. Number one, futures market enabled you to do things early, like be able to get a sheen or something like this that you really wanted to be able to buy right away. It helped you like recall and get like a sheen or a lost chapter or something like that very early on and right away, in a way that gave you an early power spike that was worth, okay, I lose 50 gold, but I gain a lot of power early. So if I can get 200 extra gold worth of power now for the next 10 minutes, but I lose 50 gold, it's totally worth it, and it's very strong. On top of that, you'd go and, hey, if I ever need to complete an item and I don't quite have the gold, I'm always able to, if I'm within 200 gold or 250 gold of an item, futures market was going to let you complete that item. And since item completions are very, very powerful, and again, there's that present value of gold concept, the idea that gold in League is worth much more earlier than it is later on. That kind of really helped futures market, because futures market cost you gold later, but gave you a lot of gold in the short term. It was like, it was worth losing 50 gold in interest or whatever to get 200 gold in the short term, especially for completing an item that you wouldn't have been able to complete or getting an early power spike like a Sheen or a Lost Chapter. Problem with cashback is it doesn't enable any of those early crazy components like Lost Chapter or Sheen, because you don't get it until you've fully completed a legendary item. When you do complete a legendary item, you get a lot of gold back, but it's at the time where it's maybe the most useless, because number one, you're not getting gold that helps you get your first item faster like you do with like you did with futures market. You're getting the gold after you've bought your first item already, so you have to be able to fully complete your first item anyways in the first place. It doesn't help accelerate your first item at all. And because, as we talked about, really the earlier the thing comes into play, the better, whether it's any rune, but especially with gold. Because of that, sure, I get a bunch of gold back, but at what time in the game am I getting it? If I don't get it until I've already completed my first item, how important is your second item? Now, for some champions, their second item might be very important. So, for example, I could see some 80 carries, especially with this big buff, like, Yuntal IE users saying, hey, I'm pretty weak when I have Yuntal, and I'm going to be weak, but if I can get 8% cash back on the item and get to Yuntal Infinity Edge very quickly, spend less time with the stacked Yuntal but no IE, and just quickly get into my 2-item spike, that could be very good for champions that really like their 2-item spike. And in solo queue especially, obviously, like, 1 item is the most important, but second item is also important, especially for a lot of champions. Now, for support, obviously, I don't know. For support, depends on how much gold you're getting, I guess. But it's a little bit ticky-tacky. I mean, let me just do the math real quick. So let's say you buy, like, Locket. So Locket 2200 or 2300. I might be out of the loop if I don't remember this one. Let me see real quick. Let me just double-check this real quick. I think it's 2200, right? Yeah, it's 2200. But like Knight's Vow, it's 2300, for example. But anyways, so let's say you get 8% back on that. It's 176 gold. So, yeah, I mean, again, even with the 8%, 176 gold on like completing Locket doesn't feel that nice for a lot of reasons. So like I was saying, doesn't help accelerate any important component into an item. Doesn't help you get your first item any faster at all. When you're completing like your boots and your first item, you're like, a lot of times, I mean, unless you're just getting fed out of your mind, you're going to be at like 20 minutes into the game or something like that. So you're getting like 170, well, I guess you get more if you're, talking about like another lane. But for support, at least, if you're getting like 170 gold, it's like, okay, but it's not 170 gold like, again, with futures market. It's like, okay, here I get 200 extra gold to spend on an item when I need to complete it. But you're getting the extra gold at like the worst time. It's like right after you've completed an item. So when you're right after you've completed an item, you're as far away as possible from completing your second item power spike as you could possibly be. Therefore, that 170 gold, or for another role, maybe a little bit more, 200, 300 gold, is as useless as it could be in some ways, because you're not at that point where you're completing your second item. Okay, let me try it with a more expensive item here and see. Like, let's say we're playing top lane and we get like a Triforce or something like that, like a really expensive item. So that's 3333. What do I get? My 8% cash back. 266 gold. I don't even get 300 gold for it. Maybe I was wrong. When I saw 8%, I was like, wow, that sounds like a lot. But to be honest, there's a lot of runes in here that give you a lot, right? Like, for example, Magical Footwear gives you 300 gold worth of boots for free. Now, granted, it does suck that you get them delayed compared to like being able to buy them, very early on. And that for certain matchups and stuff like that, that's maybe not really a great option. But Magical Footwear is essentially giving you 300 gold, and it's giving you the 300 gold even though Magical Footwear is delayed. It is actually giving you the 300 gold earlier than cashback, because you get the 300 gold from cashback, actually a little bit less than that, when you've completed your first item at like 20 minutes, whereas you're getting, your 300 free gold for Magical Footwear at like 10 minutes into the game. So in that way, magical footwear seems to just outpace cashback. And then you've got other things like even with biscuits being nerfed, right? Like biscuits give you 90 maximum health for free. Like they permanently increase your maximum HP by 30 for every one that you use. So I forget, what is the gold value of health? Let me just see here real quick. Well, ruby crystal gives you 150 health. It's 400. Um, uh, so it's 2.66 gold per health. So if we take that and then we multiply it by 90, we get 240 gold worth of maximum HP from biscuits. And that's just the 30 maximum HP that you get from consuming each of the 3 biscuits or selling them and getting that maximum HP. That's not even including the utility of the healing that you get from the item. And biscuit has been nerfed, but only the, the healing a little bit. So it's like even biscuit and magical footwear are still outpacing cash back. And let's keep in mind as well, same thing with biscuit, I'll say, that you're getting the 240 gold worth of health stats from biscuit much faster into the game than you do with cashback, because you're usually using or getting rid of the biscuits to get the maximum HP before you would complete your first item most of the time. It's kind of different how people use it on support versus other roles. There are some people who hold it for like team fights, and I think that that's weird. I think that part of the thing is most of the value of the biscuit is actually the maximum health that you get, not the healing from it, at least in my opinion. And so because of that being the value, I'd actually rather use my biscuits early, even though sure I heal for more in a team fight later on. In fact, this change here, taking it off of the maximum health, actually pushes the use case of biscuit back even further towards like I use it, where I would use it pretty early in lane to help sustain through lane, to get away with a trade or something like that. And then I'm gaining that 30 maximum HP early, and then every time I recall, I'm getting access to that HP again, so I'm getting more value out of it by getting my maximum HP early. Whereas saving it for team fights was predicated around if I get like 1,000,000 maximum HP and then I save my biscuit for a mid-game team fight and pop it, then I'll get so much more healing in this mid-game team fight that yes, I'm giving up on biscuit being good early and having that extra maximum HP early, but it'll play a key role if I can pop 3 biscuits in one mid-game team fight or something like that. This reducing the healing that you get based on your maximum HP shifts the use case a little bit back. The point is to say that if I'm getting 240 gold worth of free stats from biscuit and the healing utility that it provides, and earlier than I would complete my first item with cashback, and I'm getting 300 free gold for magical footwear, why would I go cashback even at 8%? I think that they might actually, maybe this rune's maybe they're right. Maybe the rune sucks. Even with the buffs, I don't know. It doesn't seem all that great to me. Maybe if you're a really strong 2-item spike champion and you really don't need those other things at all, you really feel like you just have a totally free secondary rune slot. Maybe you're an 80 carry and you feel like Yuntal IE is so OP if you can get it 8% back on your Yuntal and get to IE faster. Maybe you feel like it's a really 2-item power spike oriented thing, but I don't know. Guardian here, so we're curious about this one because I think Guardian sucks really bad, especially for melee supports. I've talked about this before. I think I talk a lot about it in my Braum guide, but Guardian, in my opinion, is a very poorly designed keystone for the tank melee supports that use it like Braum. And the reason for that is because Guardian is predicated on the idea that the main easy way that you should be able to use Guardian is by using an ability on an ally. And then when you use an ability on an ally, it's going to guarantee that the Guardian goes off. So there's kind of 3 ways to pop Guardian, right? If you use an ability on an ally, it'll go off. If you stand next to them and while you're standing in a close vicinity to them, they take a bunch of damage or you take a bunch of damage, or they're literally going to die. It'll go off if they're literally going to die and you're standing on top of them. So the problem is for a lot of champions is, let's say you're a champion that wants Guardian and can't really use Aftershock all that well. The issue is that if you're one of those champions like a Braum, then Guardian kind of sucks because you don't actually have an ability. You have W, but listen to me for a second on this one. You don't really have an ability that you're using solely to, like, always at the same time as you want Guardian to go off. So for example, let's say you take Guardian on an enchanter that has a heal or a shield. When you heal or shield somebody, them getting an extra heal or shield and a little movement speed burst from Guardian is exactly what you want to happen every single time you heal or shield that person if they take damage at that time. Whereas on Braum, or any other tank melee champion that is not an enchanter, that doesn't have a built-in automatic heal or shield in their kit like that, what ends up happening is this thing goes off all the time, randomly when you don't want it to, because you're using W to reposition, you're using W to go forward on the enemy, or you, in a lot of cases, don't have a way to proc it because you're actually using W on Braum on a minion most of the time to go forward to engage on somebody in lane. And this thing pops all the time if I ever try to use my W to help somebody do a camp or to do a dragon or anything like that. So Guardian just goes off randomly all the time, and there's not a good way to prevent it from randomly going off. But if you're a Janna or something, a champion that really should, obviously, and most of them do, but really shouldn't be going Guardian and should be, going Airy or something like that that's more designed for them, it feels like Guardian is better designed for champions that are enchanters that shouldn't be touching Guardian than it is designed for the few champions that aren't enchanters, which are not tank supports that are able to use Aftershock but not enchanters. It just doesn't fill that role in between and bridge that gap. And so it just goes off randomly all the time. You're not going to save your W only to use Guardian or only to make sure Guardian's going off properly. So it's just getting randomly popped all the time whenever you're using your W to try to do anything else. You don't always want to use Braum W to pop Guardian and vice versa. You don't always want to use Guardian or whatever and then in a way that aligns with W on Braum. So it just really sucks. And it's like there's only a couple of champions that aren't taking Airy and aren't enchanters or aren't taking Aftershock and aren't completely tank engage supports. So why can't Guardian just actually fit the playstyle of these champions that are in the middle? Okay, shield 45 to 150. And then they nerfed the heck out of it because enchanters were OP with it. And it's just left, a lot of other, again, these tank melee supports like Braum, Wardens, or whatever you want to call them, just left them completely homeless as far as the Keystone goes. 45 to 150, going up to 45 to 180. So there's a lot of extra scaling there on the shield. So you're getting an extra 30 scaling on the shield. 5% bonus AP ratio, or HP ratio, is staying the same, but the AP ratio is going from 15% to 25%. So I really hate that because the whole reason why Guardian got nerfed was because enchanters were doing too well with it, and then they buffed the AP ratio by 10%. That should have just not changed, and they should have given more shielding in the base amount, because again, Braum and these other Warden supports are not ever going to get any AP, and so it's completely useless for them, but it's obviously going to be useful for a little bit more shielding on enchanters. And enchanters, as I've said many times before, when enchanters get a little bit more healing and shielding, it's more than it sounds like or than you think in your head when you're making the change, because all of their healing and shielding gets multiplied by Moonstone and by healing and shielding power. So whereas Braum gets an extra 30 flat, doesn't do anything other than 30 flat shielding, but an enchanter gets, if they have 100 AP, they get an extra 10 here, but their extra 10 is actually like 15 when you take Moonstone into account. And then, with healing and shielding power, eventually they scale to a point where it's all the way up to like they're getting damn near 20% or yeah, like 20% AP ratio buff, but they were getting like 20 shielding out of it instead of 10, even though the buff reads 10 flat if you have 10 AP or 100 AP. So anyways, the point is that I don't understand if enchanters are the problem with this rune, because it's better designed for them than it is for wardens, and they had to nerf it because it was too good on enchanters. Why are they buffing the AP ratio for enchanters and not just focusing on the base amount? I don't understand that at all. We recently adjusted Guardian to make it more attractive to enchanters, and now we'd like to revisit the rune to push up its desirability across all classes, both tanks and otherwise. What? They didn't adjust Guardian to make it more attractive to enchanters. They had to nerf it because it was too good on enchanters. I don't even understand. We don't want an early surge of health to make it impossible to all-in squishy champions in lane, so we're mostly backloading this buff by increasing its level and AP scaling. So you're telling me that this change is mostly targeted at enchanters? That they're actually trying to buff... Well, I guess they said both tanks in other words. It seems like there was way too... This is ridiculous. Way too much focus here on making this change about helping enchanters. Okay, Hail of Blades. So since Guardian sucks, although they did actually buff it a little bit, so maybe that's fine. But we got to continue to think about our alternatives on Braum, such as Hail of Blades. Okay, so what do they got for us here? Interesting. Okay. Hail of Blades has its share of hardbound users who we tune against the rune. But it would also be nice if it had a set of champions who wanted to occasionally run it. The combat pattern of melee Hail of Blades is pretty compelling, so we'd like to buff it for melee champions in order to give it more of a fighting chance. This is really interesting. So for melee champions, Hail of Blades is going from 140% bonus attack speed to 160%. You know, it's not as big of a buff as it sounds. And Guardian got buffed too, so although the Guardian buffs and the weird justification for it and it being kind of focused at enchanters or whatever is weird, better for enchanters than for tanks again, even though they had to nerf it because it was too good for enchanters, so they don't even know what they're doing or what they've done in the past. Like, even though Guardian brings up that discussion, at the end of the day, Guardian got buffed, and, you know, so it's still going to be better probably. But I asked the question when it was getting nerfed before, like, why not Hail of Blades? And I honestly don't know. I've ran Hail of Blades a ton on the past on Braum in Master Plus, and I think it's totally viable. But, you know, there's just no data on it because nobody ever does it. So it's hard for me to say 100% that, you know, am I doing the right thing, or am I trolling and shooting myself in the foot a little bit by taking this this keystone? But the thing is that obviously Braum synergizes really well with Hail of Blades, and all of the runes in the Guardian tree, in the, you know, in the Resolve tree, have been nerfed quite a bit. You know, Bone Plating got nerfed, Second Wind got heavily nerfed. What else do we got? We got like Unflinching got nerfed. Like literally all of the runes that you go down that tree got nerfed, except for, I think, Font of Life is the same, I believe. So, and then, you know, so when they had nerfed Guardian before, I was saying, well, Guardian's nerfed, Second Wind and Bone Plating are nerfed, Unflinching's nerfed, and it just seems like, you know, you're at a certain point, you nerf the whole tree so much that alternatives that maybe aren't being played a lot could actually be the better option. And I think Hail of Blades as a keystone is totally fine on Braum. And he gets pretty decent value from the other things too. Like, there's nothing really wrong with the other ones. For example, like Cheap Shot, he can apply off of CC. They changed the sudden impact so that rather than giving you lethality or magic penetration, which is obviously not very useful on a champion like Braum, they changed that to just give you like a flat amount of true damage, which is actually even more than cheap shot. So you can go sudden impact on Braum, because when you W in, you can when you W in on Braum, you can you get sudden impact true damage on your auto attack afterwards. There's nothing wrong, obviously, with like the zombie ward, or I forget what they even all are now, but the different ward options. Is zombie ward even a thing anymore? I forget. Anyways, the different, obviously that whole line in that whole row in that tree is obviously really geared at support. So getting those different ward options is totally fine. And then there's nothing wrong with like a relentless hunter that's going to let you roam better, or and show up at plays more frequently and better. Obviously all supports love that. And then there's nothing, even if you wanted to go alternatively, not much wrong with the item haste either for a champion that's going to go things like lock-in redemption. And there's nothing wrong, honestly, if you want a third option in that row, not much wrong with going something like Ultimate Hunter, which is totally fine on a lot of champions, including Braum. Braum has a very long ult cooldown, and is actually one of the few champions where you can try to fight in lane in solo queue off of your ult's cooldown quite frequently, actually. So there's a lot of different options in Hail of Blades. And then it's not like you even have to give up on all of the other stuff that you would get in the resolve tree, because let's say you think Font of Life is just really nice and it's the one that hasn't been nerfed, or you feel like you need bone plating or second wind to like survive lane and for burst survivability or something like that. You don't want to give those things up in the resolve tree, but you feel like Guardian is not as useful as it should be, and you feel like Overgrowth and Unflinching are pretty useless, then you can just go those things second, right, with Hail of Blades. So you can go Hail of Blades and Resolve. And if for whatever reason you feel like going Hail of Blades with Inspiration, you can do that too if you want. So I don't know. I think Hail of Blades Braum, I might have to try that again. Legend Bloodline. Lifesteal per stack is going from 0.35% with 5.2% lifesteal maximum to 0.4% with 6% lifesteal maximum. Bloodline's current tuning has left it a pretty underwhelming state. Interesting. Given that lifesteal is so highly sought after, its pick rate has remained quite steady regardless, still lurking to return some power and satisfaction to the rune when picked up. I think that that's really good. I think that AD carries ought to have a little bit more lifesteal to be a little bit less susceptible to everything in the game. So I think that this is a nice little buff to Bloodline, and I think that AD carries should be prioritizing Bloodline more. The one concern I would have is, like they said, AD carries have been taking Bloodline anyways most of the time, and it seems like it has a little bit of a higher win rate most of the time anyways. So I don't really know, like, now that they buffed it, are people just never going to take Alacrity, the attack speed one? They're just always going Bloodline. And then Riot's going to come back in 2 weeks and say, oops, Bloodline is the only thing anyone's taking. We want things to be a choice and viable and stuff like that. So now we're nerfing Bloodline again, or we're buffing Alacrity or something. So I don't get that from a balance perspective. If they want the rune slot to be balanced, I think this just makes Bloodline better, because I think it was already better. So I don't know what they're doing with that, but I think that it's nice for AD carries to have a little bit of a buff here. Maybe just buff Alacrity so that it's at the same level. If they feel like there's not a choice being made there. Movement speed shard. Oh no, we have some like EU person writing this. So they did the 2,5 instead of the 2.5. Movement speed shard is going from 2% to 2.5%. We don't want the movement speed shard to dominate alternate options, but we do want it to be a viable option. We're cautiously buffing this rune so that players will consider it more often. This is going to be actually really interesting, because in a lot of cases, the movement speed rune was already really good, and they're kind of alluding to that, but that people just didn't take it because the movement speed just doesn't seem like, it's just such a small number. People are, baited by the dumbest things. So like when you look at the win rate stats, the movement speed shard does really, really well. But people look at it and they say, well, what is 2% movement speed? That doesn't sound very big. That sounds like it's not useful, But then they look at something like the adaptive force, and they're like, how can I give up, adaptive force, help my ability to last hit, help my burst damage? How can I give that up for a little bit of movement speed, for 2% movement speed? But it shows consistently in its win rate, it does really well. And you have to keep in mind, right, that like it's 2% movement speed on, you probably have like 365 to 400 movement speed, depending on whether you have boots or not and how far along you are. So with that, 2% movement speed is not, if you wrote it as just 8 flat movement speed, which is basically the same thing, people would probably be falling head over heels for it instead of the adaptive force. But you know how it is. We gotta wrap this up. I hear the baby. Okay, bonus movement speed on Nimbus Cloak is going from 14 to 40% to 15 to 45%. So they're buffing the bonus movement speed on Nimbus Cloak by 1%, 3%, and then 5%. I guess that's sort of interesting, but I feel like the champions that like Nimbus Cloak already go Nimbus Cloak. There's plenty of champions that already slot into this. I don't really know how it makes more champions slot into this, so that's kind of confusing to me. But I don't know. So this just seems like, I don't see how it opens up more minor choice runes or whatever, minor rune choices. I feel like this is just a buff to champions that already go a bunch of Nimbus Cloak. I don't know why you would take it more because of that change. Phase Rush, slow resistance 75% down to 50%. I think that's good. Phase Rush is really, really strong, so I think that's totally appropriate. Tenacity Shard, 10% to 15% tenacity and slow resistance. That's a big buff. That's a really big buff. Like with the movement speed shard, we'd like the tenacity shard to be viable, but we want to be careful not to invalidate champions who rely on crowd control to do their job. It's just interesting because they obviously nerfed tenacity a lot in general, but now they're like reversing that or walking that back a little bit, giving an extra 5% here. That's really cool though, actually, to think about as another alternative on Braum, is people used to go Triumph and the Tenacity Shard, but when the Tenacity Shard got hit really hard, people stopped even considering that really as a secondary option. But that's obviously something that you could do. I kind of want to see on the Tenacity Shard, League Wiki Tenacity Shard, or it's not a Tenacity Shard, it's a Legend Tenacity. Tenacity Shard is a different thing. I want to see what the patch history was, because maximum tenacity reduced to 20% from 30%. So it was 30%, then 20%. Now it's am I confused? What am I reading here? Wait, it is called Tenacity Shard. I'm so completely confused. I think they're confused. No wonder they've got me confused. This is talking about the little... No, it's not. Wait, okay, hold on. I gotta look this up. I'm so confused. What are they talking about? So from what I see here, right, Legend Tenacity was removed from the game. It was replaced by Legend Haste, right? Which, oh yeah, I remember that. So, but then you have the Tenacity Shard, which is here. So they are talking about this purple Tenacity Shard, but they shipped in the patch notes the picture of the old Tenacity rune, Legend Tenacity. This picture doesn't exist anymore. That's not what Tenacity Shard is. So no wonder they've got me confused. Riot's completely confused. I don't know why they showed that. I was like thinking about this as a rune option, like a secondary minor rune option, but this is the shard. So the shard's going from 10 to 15%. That's really nice, and it's a little bit of a different story, right? Because obviously you had at one point when Legend Tenacity was very strong, a maximum of 30% tenacity, then that went down to 20%. But you have to keep in mind, and now we're at 15%, but you have to keep in mind that it's 15% plus you get a different secondary rune, right? This is a, these shards are, well, not really new anymore, but they're new-ish compared to like what we're talking about here with Legend Tenacity. So yes, you get less, but it's a shard instead of a secondary rune. Um, so that is a pretty significant buff. I will say as well, I've been keeping an eye on the Tenacity Shard, and there are a lot of champions that, believe it or not, have a pretty decent win rate with the Tenacity Shard instead of the other things. And that's just taking it generically, like a lot. That's not necessarily it being taken in the right situations always. So, all of a sudden, if you're taking this just in the right situations, I mean, imagine you're against an Ashe or something like that, where there's a lot of CC every auto, or Rylex users or something where there's a lot of slows. All of a sudden, you get that extra 15% tenacity and slow resistance instead of, maybe a little bit of health. And I think that could be worth it in a lot of cases, and it's a pretty big buff. Triple Tonic, which is the last thing, the bonus gold that you're getting from the Elixir of Avarice is going from 40 to 60, and the Elixir of Force, Adaptive Force, is going from 20 to 30. Triple Tonic has been dwarfed by the ever-popular Biscuit delivery for some time now. While we're shipping a small nerf to Biscuits this patch, we're also looking to give this rune a stronger identity through its short windows of power, giving a potentially better early game recall and then an all-in opportunity at level 6. I kind of like that. This is another one of those runes I feel like people are going to underexplore because it's a very niche kind of, I guess, not straightforward rune that you have to play around. But obviously there's a lot of potential for this rune even as it is. Like they said, especially compared to Biscuits, when Biscuits are getting nerfed a little bit. And now they're giving you, 20 extra gold for free on the rune plus 10 extra adaptive force, with the Elixir of Force. So that's kind of interesting. Then there's, ARAM changes, bug fixes, blah, 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 arena stuff. And that's the end of the patch. Upcoming skins, they got Panda Pal Lux, Machine Herald Victor, Mecha Kingdoms Darius, and Mecha Kingdoms Wukong. Okay, we got 4 skins this patch. Riot's thinking about making a little bit more money this time instead of releasing the bare minimum 3. I'll say it every single time until they start doing more. How can 3 or 4 skins every 2 weeks be the profit maximizing point? I don't understand it. But hey, that's just an economics thing. I don't get it. How can you release 3 or 4 skins every 2 weeks? They obviously, the skins team is the only one that makes them any money. And I don't have any skin in this game, no pun intended, right? But they should hire some more skin artists or something like that, right? Obviously, since they're the only ones at the company making them any money. So I don't know. I'd fire half the balance team, no offense, hire me on the balance team, and then hire like 10 more skin artists, and then like double the number of skins that they're producing. But that's just me. We'll see. With that being said, good luck in solo queue and have a wonderful day.